Hello there everyone. So each race has a lot of different buildings, and choosing not only what to build but on which order and why can be essential in having a good early game, which then translates of course to a better late game. So therefore, to facilitate a little bit your decision making, here are 5 tips for buildings that I often give to anyone for any faction. Now note, of course, there are many different approaches and it varies a lot depending on the faction, so this is a little bit hard to generalize, but that's the purpose of this. Let's go on the basics of buildings and see if we can help out your campaigns. So without further ado, let's start with tip number 1. So tip number 1, the key is efficiency. So there's no need to get a level 3 building in your main settlement, in your province capitals. That could be in a minor settlement. So you should check which buildings can only be built in your capital provinces, typically the ones that reach level tier 4 and tier 5, of course, and then you should adjust. For example, the barracks for the military recruitment here, the barracks for the empire, and the marksman building, they can be built in a minor settlement to the fullest. So it is often better to not waste building slots on your capital province for those buildings early on. Of course, you may want to be recruiting at the same time, so you got to be careful with the timing. So perhaps just do this demolishing and exchange when you actually don't need to be recruiting the units that you get from those buildings. Another example is here on the Tyrian or most high elf campaigns. They also start with barracks that go only to tier 3, or that citizen militia building that only goes up to tier 3. So whenever possible, you gotta destroy that building and ensure you can build it elsewhere. Just be careful not to be recruiting again, that same idea. So you have a province with 4 settlements. As soon as you conquer them, likely you'll be changing the building slots to ensure that these tier 3 buildings can go into the minor settlements, reserving room for the better tier 4 and 5 possible buildings for your capital. In essence, be very effective in how you use the slots for each of your settlements. Tip number 2, you gotta picture your early, mid, late game army, and then you build towards those as effective as possible. So you gotta build to get to this, a bit more on that later, but let's get an example here on my Gorbet campaign. So in essence, all that I need for that composition for him is actually 2 buildings. I need the barracks, it gives me the black orcs, it gives me the black orc big boss. I'm even counting the hero, you know? And then I need the trolls and the hag, the giant river troll hag, and in addition, that will give me also the stone trolls. So overall, that's all that I need. I have 2 buildings that will give me the whole army. And you can see here, there's only 2 buildings complete to upgrade that army that I have. I even have a later game possibility with the Arachnorok spiders there, the flanger ones, with tier 5, which requires yet another building, but it's not like I'm in requiring that, because honestly, the second army that you see here with the archers, it's doing just fine, and I'm feeling really comfortable with it. So the idea here is just that you picture this a little bit, and you know how the progression goes, so that you always know, hey, the orc boys and the black orcs, they have the same buildings. The orc Arab boys have the same building. That's a perfect immediate first building that we're gonna get. You know, well, likely I'm gonna get some income building, then go to that military building as soon as possible. Then it's a tier 3 building. We already discussed that previously. Maybe we can get it in a minor settlement. So that sort of idea immediately gives you the choices of where I'm gonna build and when and why, because of your building to try to reach specific armies. Tip number 3 is to check your military buildings for how many unit roles they actually have. So let me give you an example here with Grand Cathay. You have frontline units, you have a ranged unit, you have a flyer unit, so that's basically a flanking unit if needs be. You even have a hero, you have an anti-large unit. What more do you need from one building that even goes to the tier 3? So it can be on a minor settlement building. So this is perfect. let's compare then to this building, which only gives me at tier 3 a cavalry unit, and then it gives me a flying cavalry unit at tier 5. That's not as efficient. So this is the sort of idea. You're going to get much better use from that barracks building because it has a lot more variety than the one from the cavalry. Same thing here with the one with the Celestial Lions. It gives me a hero. It also gives me a single entity, a lot variety of single entities, flyers, even the sentinel. So it's really effective. That's how I want you to see. A case example of how effective it can be, it's with the Savage Orcs. You get the front line, you have the archer, you have the cavalry units, and you have the big guns, which will later on become your best front line for the Savage Orc units. And essentially, you only really need this building for some of these armies. So you can get very effective just with one building for your forces. And then, for example, here with the greenskins, you still have like this weapons or war machines and catapults, which is perfect. Another building that has a variety of units. So whenever you see this sort of variety, try to see if you can come up with compositions that will reinforce that will have that idea. Moving here, for instance, to the Vampire Coast. It also has a very nice building. So you can use zombie pirate gunnery bombs almost like your front line. They're like a meat shield. It says they're a meat shield. It's the same thing as the other ones, but they have a ranged attack. So they'll always get some damage done. Then you have your handgunners for all-purpose stuff, bombers for when they clump up. You have the gunnery mobs with hand cannons, with it's a good anti-large. It doesn't really have an anti-large bonus, by the way. It's just the idea of how it works. It actually is good anti-large. And then you have an even better monstrous infantry that is good at holding the line, and a hero. So overall, with just one building, you can actually make a whole army out of these. I have army suggestions that are based solely on just this building, and they work pretty much from early to mid game, even sometimes late game. Compared to the artillery building, although it is important, it only gives you range. That's it. It only gives you range. It doesn't give you any other roles. This other building, for instance, with the typical barracks, does give me some meat shield, some front line, a halberd unit, and a fast unit. So this sort of decision making is what you need to do. Do you need those roles, or can you get away with not having those? Tip number 4, to balance the growth, control, corruption, income quite strategically. Mostly in terms of buildings, we're talking about the infrastructure. But let me give you an example here with the Lizardmen, which I consider to be one of the worst, basically. Why? Because they have a growth building and casualty replenishment rate, then they have an income building, it's a nice one, they have a control building, and then they have a corruption building. But they don't merge these buildings. You need 4 to deal with all of that. So this is one of those cases where if you can manage to have a building that gives you growth, and gives you corruption and destruction, or gives you control as well, that's much better. That's much more efficient. You know, the more buildings you need to have that whole balance, the worse. So where you're going to get the balance usually is with landmarks, or usually with resources, sometimes with some mechanics, sometimes with skills from the heroes and lords. So overall, that's the sort of things that you need to check. Or is there any other building that actually gives me everything, that gives me like reduced corruption, or that gives me income and some control? So before you start building up, really check, how am I going to do this? For example, this building gives me little corruption and more control, and it's a little bit better perhaps to use that than the one that only gives me corruption. Of course, it gives you different units, but that's the sort of decision making that you need to do before you reach that point, okay? So let's get on a better example of some combined buildings. So, for example, on the dwarves do have that growth and casualty replenishment rate. This is typically something that always happens, but then they have an income building that also reduces construction costs. And then you have yet another income building that has Oath Gold, which ties into to one of their mechanics, the Forge. And then they have a nice control and corruption denial with also a dwarf beer resource production. So that will interfere with your income because of the trade. And this even gives less corruption in adjacent provinces. So you can see how much more value you're going to get with even just one of these buildings. Then you even have these lookout camps. Less corruption, more control. You should note always that it doesn't really grow too much. Like it only gets one more corruption reduction per level. So even the first level on the tier 2 is already giving you the maximum control that it can give there, +3, and a very good corruption idea. Then, of course, you always will get skills, ancillaries, etc. that will help with that. And that's how you should tie in things together. For example, I'm going to check corruption. Can I get rid of most of the corruption by just using those skills on my lords? And I believe so. Purebeard is pretty fine. I don't have to waste on the other ones. I'm going to move into casualty replenishment rate here. I'm going to move into inquiring mind, that's for sure. Maybe I'll use lightning strike. So maybe I won't have the corruption building as a priority. You see what I'm saying? You gotta synergize what buildings you have and the necessities that you will need compared to your mechanics, to your research, to your lord skills, etc. So pay attention to your buildings and then adapt to whatever you can so that you can balance out that growth, income, public order or control, and corruption. So another example here, for instance, on Kislev, they have some nice, interesting ideas in terms of buildings. There's some buildings that always produce units and also produce some other stuff, like income from all buildings, like their own income, which is always nice. And their own infrastructure buildings, they're kind of cool. Because the infrastructure buildings, you have one that just produces income, that's fine. But one produces income, growth, and less recruitment costs. Oh, that's nice. And then we have one that gives me the casualty replenishment rate and reduced corruption and even more income from the farms if you have both. So, of course, you always should keep checking these sort of situations. And then this one gives me the devotion, even more growth. So, as long as you're combining these ones and realizing, oh, I'll have more than enough growth, but do I have enough income to build everything? In my retrospective from playing all the campaigns, the higher difficulties, you always need to prioritize the income. Always need to prioritize the income. So if you can have a building that gives you income plus something else, that's very valuable. That's really valuable. And then you'll put your lord or your research focusing on the other stuff, such as control and corruption, to ensure that you don't fall out on those other aspects. There's no point, for instance, on growing too much if you don't end up having the money to build up the better buildings because they are expensive. So that's the sort of balancing act that you need to have. Balance the growth with the income, with the control, with the corruption, without focusing too much on one or the other. If you need to focus, I would say that income is much better than the other three ones, just because with income you can correct course. Without income, you may be having some troubles in correcting that course. See the idea? One key example that I would like to talk about is with the Skaven, and some other factions have this as well, where they have income in each building. So this just adds value to whatever you're building, and sometimes all that you need is just to think, oh, if I'm going to have the growth and the casualty replenishment rate and have some income, that's perfect. That's really great. I can have even some income and some corruption denial, that's perfect as well. And income and control from here, so that's great. So you don't always have to choose between. Just make sure that you are getting where you need. You don't want to have a complete total surplus of growth that you cannot use, or a surplus of control that doesn't really give you any benefits. You know, so that's the sort of idea that I want you to have. But you always want to have a surplus of income. So make sure that you check, for instance, this sort of ideas, the landmarks, the resources. See if they will give you enough income so that you can have the control building. And then suddenly, with 2 buildings, you have everything that you need to keep your provinces stable, to give you some income, and then you can focus on the military buildings. Tip number 5 is that you need to decide very early in the campaign if you go for a quick tier 5 or 4 capital, or if you keep in the tier 3 for a while. And this is usually tied up to what you get in terms of units early on, tier 3, and against tier 4, tier 5. For instance, Vampire Counts. You get good frontline units, and a halberd unit, a great weapon unit, so you have pretty much everything there. Now you need just some flyers, the Vargeist, that's good. If you need some oomph in the land, you get some crypt horrors, you have some cavalry options, of course, but you'd lack the single entities. The Black Coach is not really that big of a single entity, and you get the better units, the ones that everyone really likes to use, the Mortis Engines, the Blood Knights, the Terrorgeists as well, the Vampires. So overall, having at least one decision of going, hey, maybe this settlement I really need to get to tier 5. Sometimes the decision is not just the units, it's actually the landmarks. You need to get to that landmark really fast. But in terms of the vampire counts, for instance, you can also say, well, I can count on the Raised Dead. I don't need to really go over the tier 3 units, because I can get the tier 4 and 5 units from Raise the Dead locations. So overall, that's the sort of decisions that I want you to have. Because suddenly you go like, maybe I don't need too much growth. I can invest in more income. And if I can invest in more income, I can get more armies. If I can get more armies, then of course I can capture more land, etc. That's the sort of decision making that I want you to have. Let's give another example here with the Lizardmen. They're very difficult in terms of buildings precisely for that. So overall, you have some decent tier 3 units, of course, the Chameleon Stalkers, the Skinks. Yeah, they're decent, but the Saurus are the bread and butter, let's say. You have the Croxigors, they can do a front line. But you have the Temple Gods, you have the Ripperdactyls, you have most of your single entities, the Dread Saurians, you have the Ferocarnosaurs, Troglodons, Stegodons. All of those, the Ancient Stegodon Engine of the Gods, the Skink Oracle, all of those on tier 4. And they're so important to reach to. You can have, of course, a ton of armies on tier 3 and I have examples of those working really well. But you have to plan out how to grow these provinces quickly to tier 4, tier 5 to ensure that you gain access to those units as quick as possible. Or sometimes to just get the landmarks like you have in here in the Isthmus of Lustria. So that's sort of the decision making that I want you to do. And sometimes you're completely forced to do it. Bretonnia is a quick example of that. Yes, you have some tier 3 units like Battle Pilgrims, Knights of the Realm, and Questing Knights that are good, but everything else is really, well, it's not tier 4. And then you need the Royal Pegasus, the Hippogriffs, the Grail Knights and Grail Guardians, even the Blessed Field Trebuchets. So if I'm playing with the Bretonians, I really want to grow the initial capital as fast as possible. I'll search for the growth building immediately. I'll put any growth ancillary right away. I'll see if I have skills for that. I'll see if I have any landmarks that will help with that. You know, everything that I can put into growth so that I can reach those top tier units, which will help me win the game eventually. That's the sort of idea. So as soon as I enter here, I will check, do I have anything here important? Maybe I'll get the corruption, and then I'll get for the growth. Maybe that's what I will do. Maybe I don't want to do that with Leon Core, but maybe I can do that with the Second Lord. That's the sort of idea that I want you to have. Just plan it out. Am I going to need to grow this to tier 4 or tier 5 fast? And the faster you start, the better. Maybe it will decide even your research. Do you have early research that gives you growth, even if it is +5 or +10 growth? Just check it out and see if you can go for it. Growth +4, that's perfect. Growth +10, that's perfect. Everything adds up to get to that specific goal that you have. So to resume, tip 1 is the key is efficiency of building slots. Make sure that you plan those out as soon as possible. Tip 2, to picture your early, mid, late game army, and then you build towards those, even if just a rough estimate. Tip 3, check military buildings for how many unit rolls they have. Have a preference of those. Tip 4, balance the growth, control, corruption, income strategically. Sometimes you will need to go for income all the time. Sometimes you need to grow. especially on tip number 5. Sometimes you need to control and corruption because you're surrounded by others giving you bad corruption, etc. Tip number 5 is to decide early if you go to a quick tier 4 or 5 or if you keep in tier 3. I hope this helps out. And there you go. So of course there's too many races to give you the ideas too. There's no way I can resume everything. So of course, if I have a playthrough, for instance, I can explain it better. If I have a playthrough like I'm doing with Gorbet, I can explain better my decision making, or you can watch others and see how they build up. But this is just how I typically feel, or I think towards everything, towards the synergy between the buildings, between the army, between the progression in the game. For instance, sometimes I'll just see the initial race and I'll see what do I get from these lords, the faction effects, or from the lord effects. Do I have anything that really covers some of the typical building effects? You know, like there's one here for upkeep of the units. That's good, but do I have anything for corruption, for example? Do I have anything that gives me control overall? You know, that sort of idea gives you a better understanding. This is a good example with Miao Ying's faction effect giving less corruption. So when you're playing with her, maybe you really don't need to invest too much into the less corruption building. That's the sort of idea that I want you to have. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this helps. Bye-bye.